The plane may have been headed for either the White House.
What will happen to the financial markets when they finally reopen?
In the next 2 hours, the time when we usually bring you Business Center, we will look forward as best we can. We will hear from CNBC reporters who have.
Then another jetliner flying overhead is
Wide. And we're going to dip in now as the crisis seems to be continuing overseas in one form or another. As part of an agreement today among news organizations to share all news gathering, we have these pictures of what is going on in Kabul, Afghanistan right now. These are coming in via a digitized video phone where we have just watched missile attacks in the skies over Kabul, Afghanistan. Anti-aircraft rockets in the air, explosions and tracers visible in the night sky. Kabul is the seat of power in the nation of Afghanistan, and you see there in the distance a line of flames. What we're lacking here is context, connection between what happened today, the events that may change life in the United States of America, and what is happening half a world away tonight in the dark, in the skies and on the ground in Kabul, Afghanistan. But these are live pictures coming in via CNN on a video phone. Let's begin our coverage with this in mind with NBC News Chief Foreign Affairs Correspondent Andrea Mitchell in Washington. Andrea, what are we watching? What's its connection?
Difficult to know what we're watching, but it would be, if they are missile attacks, it would most likely be American retaliation against Kabul, because we had warned the Taliban leaders of Afghanistan that if there were any evidence indicating that Osama bin Laden, whom they've been harboring for many years, was responsible for today's attacks or for any other attacks, that we would retaliate. This warning has been communicated to the Taliban leaders directly and indirectly over the course of many weeks. They denied today any involvement by bin Laden, but we have been told by top officials in the United States government that they are 90% sure that bin Laden was responsible. I don't think we would have been told that if they didn't have enough evidence to retaliate. So what you may be watching, and I should stress, Brian, that we don't know the source of this video, but what you may be watching is tracer attacks, signs of missile attacks on Kabul, and if that is the case, it could well be a U.S. retaliation for what happened today.
Andrea, the missiles were earlier visible in midair, and the trails behind them were consistent with what we've seen to be cruise missile attacks in the past. Now we see the flames flaring up in the center of the lens. We're going to pause just a minute. We'll dip into the audio of their coverage. We'll come back and talk further about what is underway tonight.
First, we're seeing the flash, and then we hear the detonation some several seconds afterwards, and they appear to be coming from that airport area, in some cases several miles away from us. There is still a lot of flashing we can see in the air reflected off clouds. That could be thunder and lightning. However, there's a possibility that those reflections are missiles landing elsewhere. The flashes as they explode and reflecting off the clouds. But it's not a good indication. We certainly don't hear any detonations coming from that particular direction at this time. The anti-aircraft fire that we were seeing a little while ago is not coming up from the city. The city, apart from the detonations we were hearing a few minutes ago, appears very, very calm. The visibility here is excellent. We can see all the way across the city. It lies on a plain that's surrounded by the mountains here in Kabul. We have high mountains to the right. These mountains were used by the Mujahideen as vantage points for shelling the city several years ago during the Mujahideen infighting in Kabul. The last 5 years, the Taliban have been in control of this city, have been trying to extend their control over and across Afghanistan. And the foreign minister this evening telling journalists and CNN that he didn't believe that Afghanistan would be attacked. He said if Afghanistan was attacked, then they would call it, the Taliban would call it, an act of state-sponsored terrorism, Joey.
All right, that is CNN's Nick Robertson. Again, please keep the line open to us. Nick Robertson there.
Andrea Mitchell back in the Washington Bureau on this day when, if nothing else, we have learned to expect anything and not to trust anything. We've had false reports of a car bomb at the U.S. State Department and a plane landing at Camp David. If, Andrea, this was indeed an American cruise missile attack, retaliation, what footprints would the attack on the U.S. have to have left behind?
Skip Brand, former counterterrorism director for the FBI.
We've apparently lost touch with Andrea Mitchell in Washington. John Palmer is at the Pentagon for us tonight. John, perhaps you can handle that question. And the question is, what footprints would the attack on the U.S. have to have left behind for retaliation to come so swiftly, it being just past 6 p.m. here in the East now?
Brian, they would have to have certainly hard evidence to trace this back to bin Laden to carry out this particular attack. It's been unusual today because officials have been rather outspoken, pointing fingers. And as Andrea Mitchell reported a short time ago, that's a little bit unusual this early. Just a short time ago, a number of reporters were picked up. We're about a half a mile from the Pentagon. As you can see behind me, that huge, horrible, gaping hole in the west side of the Pentagon where the hijacked American airliner crashed about 9:30 this morning. The officials from the Pentagon came over and picked up a group of reporters to take them over for a briefing. And I'm sure the uppermost question on everybody's mind is going to be, what about this retaliation? Is it underway? And what's going on? And how is this particular tragedy traced directly to them?
Now, John, as we look at the damage, retrace a little bit the events of this day. The attack had just taken place in New York. The government as a whole was reacting to that suddenly, and this was close to a landing pad there at the building, one of the 5 sides, as you just pointed out, having collapsed. Suddenly, all those at work and the death toll hovering around at 100 felt the concussion.
Yes, let's go back to about 9:30. Most of the people in this building were glued to television stations and television sets watching what was unfolding with the World Trade Center in New York City. And then shortly after 9:30, there was a huge blast. There were shouts in the hallways. A little bit later, smoke then filled the hallways. People dashed out. An alarm went off at the Pentagon for people to leave. We are told that Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld himself left his office, which is on the far side of the Pentagon, ran around to this gaping hole, this side of the Pentagon on the west side, and personally tried to help some of the people to get them out there. This occurred about 9:30 this morning, and hundreds of firemen have been battling the blaze now for more than 8 hours. They have it well contained, but many areas have not been searched for casualties simply because of the flames and smoke.
John Palmer at the Pentagon, thanks. We're going to go back across town to our Washington Bureau. Andrea Mitchell, we had missile trails in the sky over Kabul, Afghanistan. What have you learned about this, Andrea?
According to senior officials, they do not believe this is an American attack. This is not from the Pentagon. Let me be clear on my sourcing. It is from another intelligence agency, but they do not believe that this is a U.S. attack. They think possibly this is dissidents in Kabul, but be very careful. We have no confirmation at this point that the U.S. is retaliating against Afghanistan.
All right, so tonight, on this day that has seen an unprecedented attack on the continental United States, missiles in the air over Afghanistan, it would seem to most pros that it would be awfully early for any kind of retaliation, and indeed Andrea Mitchell's sources telling her that would be correct, that this is not U.S. sponsored in any way, that it may be some other elements. But that is the picture tonight in Kabul, Afghanistan, again on what has been a horrendous day in the United States, a day that may change the U.S. way of life. Lower Manhattan has been the epicenter of all of this beginning this morning. Most recently, it was the scene of yet another building collapse, one of the victims of today's earlier attack, really, by 2 hijacked aircraft full of passengers, and it is alleged hijacked pilots at the controls instead of the commercial jet pilots. Our own Ashley Banfield is in Lower Manhattan, where number 7 World Trade Center was the latest building to collapse late this afternoon. Ashley?
It's about 45 minutes ago. It went down right behind us. Just a thunderous cloud of dust again passing through the streets of Manhattan, Brian. It's happened 4 to 5 times already today. It was standing right behind us, as I said, at about 5:30 Eastern time. We had been warned. They were just waiting for this one to come down. The windows had already blown out. It had been an inferno for hours. We'd been cleared 5 different times northward from the from Ground Zero, where the First and Second World Trade Centers came down just after about 10 or 11 this morning. And every time we moved, there was this concern there'd be other buildings that went down. It was rather strange, but I was doing an interview with a woman and a small baby who were evacuating their apartment not far from this area when number 7 came down. Here's a look at the tape. You can see what happened. Please be careful of your baby. Oh my God. Look behind us. Please pan in this way. Please be careful of your baby. This is it.
That's the building coming down.
Oh my God. Oh my God. Oh my God. No. No. Listen.
We're okay.
We'll be all right. We'll be all right.
We're okay. Ashley! I think we're okay. Ashley, I think we're okay.
All right. We're going to have to move this way. We're going to have to move. We're going to have to move. That cloud is coming this way. Yeah. The concern is that the cloud was potentially going to be moving this way. The wind kept it eastward from us. We could maintain our position here on the perimeter. I just want to show you, Brian, from here down on the ground level in Manhattan, what some of the things that have been collected from the street can show us. I don't know if you can zoom into here, Michael, but these papers were collected from 1 and 2 World Trade Center. The headers on them say those addresses here, the 81st floor deliveries, the 87th floor deliveries, the 90th floor, the 92nd floor, what kind of parcels have come in. They were found scattered within a mile. Also this, I just wanted to show you as well. These are what were being cut as tourniquets for a lot of the triage stations that were set up in the treatment areas. I can also tell you that a police officer who had been down in that dust zone for the better part of the entire day told me that a morgue had been set up, the location of which wasn't being disclosed, but that most of the bodies, take a look at this if you can, as this vehicle goes through. That's evidence of what we've seen a lot of today. Police and emergency vehicles covered in the Mount St. Helens type dust, and also the windows blown out. An ambulance also burned all along one side. The windows blown out of it as well. The ambulance driver passing through here and telling me this ambulance was new this morning. It's really just an unbelievable scene, Brian.
All right, Ashley Banfield in Lower Manhattan. It was an unbelievable day for the traveling White House. We may never know the threat assessment as seen against this president today. This day saw him start out in Florida, then move to 2 different Air Force bases, one in Louisiana, one in the Midwest, before being en route back to Washington tonight, where we have learned he will address the nation on television. Because the White House was evacuated, the Vice President and First Lady were taken to safe places. NBC News correspondent Bob Kerr is doing his work out of FBI headquarters that has become the de facto White House briefing room this evening. Bob, good evening to you.
Brian, good evening. On the phone this time because we have moved. A small group of us now are the first to be let in back to the White House. I have just cleared security, and you know the walk. I'm walking down through the northwest gate into the driveway, looking straight at the west wing as we speak. So a small group of press now being allowed back in here to the White House. What's odd, Brian, is that tonight, a little while from now, there was supposed to be a joyous and gala barbecue on the South Lawn, a barbecue for Congress put on by President Bush. Obviously, that is not going to happen. The president himself was out of town today and kept out of town for a good while, first in Nebraska, first to Louisiana Air Force facility, and then to a Nebraska Air Force base, from where he will come back here to the White House. Also, for that matter, the congressional leaders, we're told, were also spirited out of town to protect them. I can tell you, Brian, we made a 7-block walk from the FBI building on 10th Street up here to the White House on 17th. It was and remains a ghost town in Washington. You could look down one of the major streets and see nothing but traffic lights and white lines, no cars. In one case, we saw a big fuel tanker truck escorted by 2 police cars moving quickly down one of the main streets. As you know, President Bush today has spoken about this attack on the United States twice, calling it a national tragedy, calling the incidents cowardly acts and terrorism against the United States, which he says will not stand. Here's a bit of what President Bush had to say in a statement this afternoon.
Freedom itself was attacked this morning by a faceless coward, and freedom will be defended. I want to reassure the American people that the full resources of the federal government are working to assist local authorities to save lives and to help the victims of these attacks. Make no mistake, the United States will hunt down and punish those responsible for these cowardly acts.
Brian, back here at the White House now, again, a small group of us being allowed in, awaiting, we think, what will be a statement from President Bush after he arrives here. A parting thought for you. One of the sights that was utterly unreal here today was in the skies above the White House and the National Mall in Washington. On at least 3 or 4 occasions, one could look up and see fighter jets crisscrossing in the sky. There were obviously no commercial planes around. All that had been shut down. Instead, there were overflights by jet fighters in and around the area of the White House and the Mall.
Bob Kerr back inside the White House after a day outside the White House. And for those just joining us, that is indeed Lower Manhattan you were looking at earlier. What's different about the skyline? The World Trade Center, the landmark Twin Towers, both gone. The death toll is staggering. So many people from all walks of life, and it is destined to grow throughout the evening and throughout the days ahead. Among those who died is Barbara Olson. She had a long career in public service, was a television commentator, and the wife of the U.S. Solicitor General Ted Olson. Barbara Olson, a frequent contributor on NBC News broadcasts, was 45. She was on board the plane that crashed at the Pentagon today. For more on the 4 different commercial aircraft that were hijacked, we go to NBC News correspondent Jim Cummins at American Airlines headquarters in Fort Worth, Texas tonight. Jim, good evening.
Good evening, Brian. That's right. It was outrageous and audacious, hijacking 4 commercial airliners, 2 757s, Boeing 757s, 2 Boeing 767s, fully loaded with fuel and using them as weapons. They were loaded with fuel for cross-country flights and then using them as weapons against the U.S. First, there was American Flight 11, which was scheduled to go from Boston to Los Angeles this morning. 81 passengers aboard, 9 flight attendants, 2 pilots. It was then diverted to New York, where it hit the South Tower, plowed into the South Tower of the World Trade Center at 8:50 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time. Next, United Flight 175, also bound from Boston to L.A., 56 passengers aboard, 2 pilots, 7 flight attendants on that plane. It plowed into the North Tower of the World Trade Center at approximately 9:08 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time. And then American Flight 77, bound from Washington Dulles to L.A., 58 passengers aboard, 4 flight attendants, 2 pilots. It plows into the Pentagon at approximately 9:30 this morning, just outside Washington. And finally, United Flight 93, it was going from Newark to San Francisco, 38 passengers aboard, 5 flight attendants, 2 pilots. It crashes into western Pennsylvania at approximately 10 o'clock this morning. Immediately, the government shut down all commercial air traffic until at least noon tomorrow. It disrupted trains, Greyhound buses, commercial boat traffic. The borders were closed, and so it is shut down transportation in this country virtually, Brian, until at least sometime tomorrow morning, and for the air traffic system until noon tomorrow at the earliest, is what they're telling us here at American Airlines.
Jim Cummins out in Fort Worth, Texas. Thank you for that, Jim. And joining us now from Los Angeles, former U.S. Secretary of State Warren Christopher, who served, of course, in the first Clinton administration. Mr. Secretary, good evening to you. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you, Brian.
Do you regard what happened today, as some have called it during the day, an act of war?
Yes, I think it is that, Brian. You know, a mind searches for analogy in this situation, and I've lived long enough to remember Pearl Harbor. It's an event of that dimension. This day, like that one, will live long in infamy, as President Roosevelt said.
Mr. Secretary, what then should happen? What should the threshold be in the process of finding out who's responsible, who did this?
Well, I think we have to be calm and focused, bring clarity to the situation. We have to make a very, very thorough investigation of the situation. And Brian, it's important not to get just to the immediate perpetrators, but to get to those who supported it. This event required coordination, integration, a great deal of financial support, a great deal of planning. It wasn't done by one or two people. It wasn't done in a back room. So we not only need to find out who did it in the United States, but what their supporters were abroad. One thing I would caution against is jumping to conclusions. As you may remember, in the Oklahoma City bombing, everybody thought for several days that it had then come from abroad, and perhaps we should take a lesson from that and work through this very systematically. But when we find out, then we're going to have to act great precision and great definiteness.
Is there any evidence that it is foreign terrorism per se and not domestic terrorism, given the clockwork-like timing of it all?
We don't have any evidence of that right now at all. Now, evidently, probably our intelligence agencies have some beginning evidence on the subject, but one would have to say, just without pointing any figures, that there's been a massive intelligence failure, a massive security failure for this to have happened at 4 airports in the United States, 3, possibly 4 airports, and for it to have happened with all this planning means that we really were lax, much as we were in the days before Pearl Harbor.
The president has been handed, of course, a national tragedy, the likes of which president hasn't had since about FDR, by my reckoning. If you were counseling him tonight, what points does he need to touch on for an anxious American viewing public?
Well, I think you have to emphasize the importance of being unified, and we will be unified behind him. He has to emphasize the importance of getting to the bottom of this, and as I said earlier, not just getting the immediate perpetrators, but finding out where the support came from, where the financing came from. And I think he also has to find a prescription for the future so Americans will once again feel safe. People are not going to ride on airplanes for some time without feeling a great deal of insecurity or go into big buildings. Now, America can't live like that for long. We will come back from this just as we have from other tragedies, but it's going to take a great deal of presidential and national leadership to once again make us feel safe and secure. I doubt that this day will ever be forgotten. I think we've reached a defining moment. Things will be different in the future.
When you say things will be different, and beyond the fact that flying domestically and overseas might take longer, what form will it take, do you think?
I think there will have to be a good deal of more security surveillance around the country. We'll have to step up our intelligence. We'll have to find additional ways. And also, Brian, we need to recognize that this is an international problem. The terrorists plan in one country, do their dastardly acts in another country, and flee to a third country. So we need to have a coordinated international response. We can't do it alone, but the United States has to take the lead.
You're a veteran attorney. What about when that increased surveillance, increased security runs up against the Bill of Rights?
Well, we've been able to solve those problems in the past. Brian, I think there'll be an awful lot of cooperation from the American people and the courts in recognizing that this is a dire American emergency and one that we'll have to do it within the context of our Constitution, but I'm confident that we can.
I want to get you on record on the uniquely American ability to put party labels aside and fall in line behind the chief executive during times of great national strain.
Well, we've done it over and over again, and clearly we will do it this time as we have so often in the past, as we did in 1941 after Pearl Harbor, as we did indeed after the riots in 1967 and 68. We recognize that we're in a situation where we're going to have to act together. We're going to have to act to be unified and put partisan bickering to one side as rapidly as we can.
Is there anything worse about this vis-a-vis Pearl Harbor in that we still don't know who the enemy is?
Yes, that's certainly right. There you could focus on a particular enemy, find ways to combat this, but under the present circumstances, we're going to have to take some time and find out who did it and how to react.
Well, Mr. Secretary, after what's been a very tough day in this country, when you look back at the events of the last couple of hours, you look at what have been passing for domestic political issues, in addition to this changing day-to-day life in the country, do you think this will change the access of the entire argument? Do you think this will increase now interest in things like your stock and trade, foreign affairs?
There's no doubt that it will. I think we're going to have to understand where this came from. We're going to have to understand who our enemies are around the world, and we have to understand who our friends are. I would hope and expect that all the civilized world will join us in combating this, not just our NATO allies, but China and Russia as well. We need to get together in the civilized world to combat this. And on Capitol Hill, I think there will be a whole new set of issues. I don't expect to hear much talk about what happened to the surplus in the coming days.
Did we get too lax? Did we get too carried away with the end of the Cold War?
Yes, I think there was some laxity, much as there was before Pearl Harbor. We perhaps were too confident about we are a long ways away from the terror of the Middle East. I'm not saying this came from there, but it bears many of the earmarks of that. 4 suicide bombers or groups of suicide bombers, because those planes probably weren't taken over by a single person. You can just imagine what went on board those planes. So it bears some marks of a society, a group of people that we simply don't understand and can't comprehend. But that doesn't mean we can't take full action in meeting it, even though we may not be able to comprehend it tonight as we sit in our stunned concern for the people in New York and Washington, D.C.
Former Secretary of State Warren Christopher, as always, sir, thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you, Brian.
For those of you watching us on the NBC television network, stay tuned for a special 90-minute edition of NBC Nightly News with Tom Brokaw. For those of you with us on MSNBC on cable, stay with us for uninterrupted coverage of this attack. I'm Brian Williams, NBC News.
Good evening. It is 6:30 on the East Coast. It was a little over 10 hours ago we first got word that something had happened in New York City. The word was a plane into one of the World Trade Center towers. It would get worse, much worse after that. You're looking at a live picture of the smokes 10 hours later, still billowing, obliterating what is left of the lower Manhattan skyline after those twin attacks on the towers by planes apparently driven by suicidal terrorist pilots that plowed into those buildings with military-like precision today. The casualty toll is just estimates right now. Mayor Giuliani in New York City saying perhaps 2,100 people injured, many walking wounded, many have not presented to hospitals. Uncounted others may be buried beneath the rubble. For the record, they say 5 dead on arrival at local hospitals, but the rescue efforts, the treating of the injured continues in New York City. It was shortly after the twin attacks in New York we had word that the Pentagon had been attacked. Another jetliner hijacked and driven into the Pentagon. Word from Washington, at least 100 either dead or injured. Here is the damage. There's a smoke billowed earlier from the Pentagon following those attacks today. Again, as I said, it began with what appeared to be a tragic accident, a plane plowing into a building. Watch as the sights and sounds record the drama of the day and the horror when America realized it was under attack.
There's another one. I'm taking a look.
Oh my God! Another one just hit. Something else just hit. A very large plane just flew directly over my building, and there's been another collision. Went straight into one of the twin towers. It just disintegrated instantly. It was the most awful thing I've ever seen.
It straightened itself out and dove to the other side and crashed right in. An explosion was so terrific it looked like it had dynamite in it.
radio. Get out of the area. The second tower is coming down.
They tell you the second tower is coming down?
Yes, it's about to collapse.
I got fellow officers that might be trapped. I'm not trying to be a hero, but I think if you were in this position, you'd do the same thing.
There were people falling out of the sky. We were trying to get people away when the second collapse occurred, and I dove under a truck, so I don't know how I'm here.
I spent a year in combat. I never saw anything like this.
After the first tower collapsed, we were back in there trying to bring people out. We knew the second one was about to come down, but we were lifting one person, and when it came down, we all just ran for our lives.
You could hear the rumbling. When you looked up, you could see the top of the building just crumbling. We all headed south, and you could feel the wind hitting in the back because as the debris hit.
Couldn't see. Everything was totally black. You were just walking, hoping to find daylight. It was just unbelievable. I never seen anything like it in my life.
I'm just thinking about the firemen I see going up the stairs behind me and look at half of this building.
The sights and sounds in New York City, a city virtually paralyzed tonight. Its streets empty, the tunnels and bridges leading into Manhattan only allowing outbound traffic. Traffic leaving New York City, stranding millions who simply can't get back home tonight. And the search goes on for victims of that terrible twin explosions. And again, in Washington, D.C., still trying to assess the damage and the casualty figures at the Pentagon. The president will address the nation at 9 o'clock Eastern tonight. He's en route to Washington, D.C. right now aboard Air Force One. The word we get from the White House pool reporter traveling with him is that plane will be escorted by fighter jets as it makes its way into the Washington, D.C. area at Andrews Air Force Base. There might have been a fourth attack. There was a fourth hijacked airplane today, United Airlines plane that was going from Newark to California. It crashed in Pennsylvania. Right now, Governor Tom Ridge of Pennsylvania is holding a news conference. Let's join that in progress.
This can happen. There is no rational explanation because we don't resolve our differences in this country that way. I guess we have to tell them that there are people in this world who don't share the same value system or the belief system that we do, and that in a very irrational, cowardly, despicable, unconscionable, immoral act, there have been literally thousands of Americans, and God only knows, presumably maybe representatives from every single state that have been struck down as innocent victims. I will be prepared to answer a few questions. One of the things I plan on doing when I get back to Harrisburg, so I will take a few questions, and then I do have to get back to Harrisburg to sign an emergency disaster declaration. It will enable my National Guard, the state police, and others to use whatever assets and to make acquisitions and expend money to fill any gaps that they may have here locally to support this local effort. And it will be done a lot quicker if I sign an emergency declaration, which is exactly what I'll do as soon as I return to Harrisburg. I have time for a few questions because I'd like to get my signature on that piece of paper.
Have you spoken to the president?
I have not spoken to the president. He's, I think he's been engaged all day long.
Governor, have you been given any possible scenario talking to either the FBI or the state police as to how this particular plane took this flight course and possibly where it was bound?
I think it's the question you asked is on everyone's mind, and yet there are no definitive answers, and I suspect that we won't have an ability to fill in the gaps and the details for several days to come, and for me to offer anything more than you've heard from the FBI would be the grossest speculation, and you don't need that at this time. Yes. Dave.
Governor, unlike some of the other crash scenes, there is perhaps more likelihood of retrieving a black box here at the scene because we haven't seen that intact. How much of our efforts will be dedicated to that here at the scene?
Governor Tom Ridge in Pennsylvania talking about how his state is reacting to what occurred there today. One of the 4 hijacked airplanes crashing in Pennsylvania, a United Airlines plane. One member of Congress believes that plane might have been headed for Camp David. There are the pictures from far away. A smoking hole in the ground is all that's left of that 757 that had been bound from Newark to California. NBC's John Palmer is at the Pentagon, one of the places struck by a hijacked plane today. What do we know, John, about casualties now?
Lester, we know very little officially about casualties. We do know from area hospitals that a number of people have been treated for burns, some of them slight, some of them quite severe. People who arrived on the scene shortly after this hijacked plane went into the west side here of the Pentagon, saw people out on the sidewalk, some of them severely burned and trembling. Some had obviously lost their lives. Firemen here at the Pentagon have been battling now for just about 9 hours. You can still see the smoke billowing there from the building, and on the roof a number of firemen are still up there. You see the white smoke there where they're pouring water, as they have been for hour after hour on this, and there's also some dark smoke there where the fire continues to work its way in. When the jetliner, the American Airlines jetliner, came in, it came in very low, and it even knocked the top of a tree off. You can see the leaves. If we can get over and see that, you see the tree where the top of the leaves looks as though they are sheared off. That shows you how low the aircraft was when it came in. It was 1,000 feet or so, and it even got lower as it went across the Pentagon parking lot, then went over the helipad there, and then turned on its side and crashed into an area which is known as between wedge number 1 and wedge number 2. I think it's interesting to note, if you look on this side there, the fire damage is not that bad at the Pentagon, because that's an area that had been recently refurbished, and a firewall was put in there simply because of what happened in Oklahoma City at the bombing of the Murrah building. On the left side, there is much more damage there because they don't have the firewall in. The good news is part of that was evacuated because they were getting ready for the renovation, so that could have cut down on the loss of the life, but it also allowed the flames to spread on this way. In the last couple of hours, we have seen just a stream of trucks with heavy equipment. We have seen the canine patrols coming in, dogs that will, throughout this evening, be searching through the debris, looking for any sign of life, looking for survivors. A lot of lights, heavy lights were brought in. Soon this whole side of the Pentagon is going to be lit up with lights, as dozens and dozens of rescue workers who have streamed in here all day long are going to be working in the rubble, trying to see what they can do to try to find somebody who's still alive in that. Again, we don't have casualties, but we do expect to have a briefing in a short time inside the Pentagon. A number of reporters here were taken inside the Pentagon for a briefing, presumably by the Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld. Lester?
Wait for that briefing. We watched with some interest reports from Kabul, the capital of Afghanistan, of explosions there. Is the U.S. categorically denying there's any link to those explosions and what occurred here today?
Nothing official on that. Admiral Quigley, who has been briefing us from the Pentagon from time to time today, has had very little to say, nothing about casualties and nothing about the reports of what's been going on in Afghanistan. Again, that's going to be probably the very first question that is put to the Secretary of the Defense at this briefing that's coming up shortly inside the Pentagon. We're told that Secretary Rumsfeld was in his office, and as many people in this building were doing, they were watching television at the tragedy that was unfolding in New York at the World Trade Center buildings. And then they felt the building shudder, and smoke soon filled the hallways. Alarms went off, and the Pentagon then was evacuated. Secretary Rumsfeld, we're told, then came around from his office on the far side of the Pentagon over to this side, the west side, and even personally helped with some of the rescue there for the first few minutes. He then went back inside the Pentagon to the command and control center deep inside the Pentagon, and we're told that he spent most of the day there in touch with President Bush and other officials. Admiral Quigley told us a couple of hours ago that all U.S. armed forces throughout the world are now on Delta alert. That is the highest alert the Pentagon can issue. And he also mentioned that all the secretaries of the various services and all the chiefs of the services and the secretaries of the Army and the Air Force and Navy and so forth were safe, were not in this area that was hit. But as to the number of casualties, no one is speculating at this point, but they're going to be high.
NBC's John Palmer outside the Pentagon. Again, we're standing by for a number of events over the next couple of hours. Donald Rumsfeld, Defense Secretary, expected to speak very shortly. In fact, it looks like it's about to get underway. Let's switch you inside the Pentagon now. Apparently, we're still waiting for our audio. While we do that, we also want to let you know the FBI planning a news conference around 7 o'clock Eastern. That's about 15, 20 minutes from now. And at 9 o'clock Eastern, President Bush will address the nation. His plane touched down just a couple of minutes ago at Andrews Air Force Base. The president flew today from Florida, made a brief stop in Louisiana, made a statement, continued to Offutt Air Force Base in Nebraska to a military command center, and then shortly thereafter got back on Air Force One and has been en route to Washington, D.C., where, again, he will address the nation at 9 o'clock. This will be his third statement of the day regarding the attacks. And since we last heard from him, we have heard more reports from Washington, sources believing that 90% sure that Osama bin Laden has his fingerprints or is linked to the attacks today. I'm told we're getting some new pictures in right now.
Incoming.
This is a new shot of one of the plane hitting the Trade Center.
No words. No
Okay, that was a new shot we haven't seen before. Let's get back to the Pentagon now. We have audio established. Here's the Defense Secretary.
Their assistance in various ways. I'm very pleased to be joined here by Chairman Carl Levin and Senator John Warner. Senator Warner called earlier today and offered his support and was kind enough to come down and has been with us. We've very recently had a discussion with the President of the United States. Chairman Hugh Shelton has just landed from Europe. Secretary of the Army Tom White, who has a responsibility for incidents like this as executive agent for the Department of Defense, is also joining me. It's an indication that the United States government is functioning in the face of this terrible act against our country. I should add that the briefing here is taking place in the Pentagon. The Pentagon's functioning. It'll be in business tomorrow. I know the interest in casualty figures, and all I can say is it's not possible to have solid casualty figures at this time. And the various components are doing roster checks, and we'll have information at some point in the future, and as quickly as it's possible to have it, it will certainly be made available to each of you. I'll be happy to take a few questions after asking first General Shelton if he would like to say anything, and then we will allow the others to make a remark or two.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Ladies and gentlemen, as the Secretary just said, today we have watched the tragedy of an outrageous act of barbaric terrorism carried out by fanatics against both civilians and military people, acts that have killed and maimed many innocent and decent citizens of our country. I extend my condolences to the entire Department of Defense families, military and civilian, and to the families of all those throughout our nation who lost loved ones. I think this is indeed a reminder of the tragedy and the tragic dangers that we face day in and day out, both here at home as well as abroad. I would tell you up front, I have no intentions of discussing today what comes next, but make no mistake about it, your armed forces are ready.
Chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee, Carl Levin.
Our intense focus on recovery and helping the injured and the families of those who were killed is matched only by our determination to prevent more attacks and matched only by our unity to track down, root out, and relentlessly pursue terrorists, states that support them, and harbor them. They are the common enemy of the civilized world. Our institutions are strong, and our unity is palpable.
Senator John Warner.
Thank you. As a past chairman preceding Carl Levin, I can assure you that the Congress stands behind our president, and the president speaks with one voice for this entire nation. This is indeed the most tragic hour in America's history. And yet I think it can be its finest hour, as our President and those with him, most notably our Secretary of Defense, our Chairman, and the men and women of the armed forces all over this world stand ready not only to defend this nation and our allies against further attack, but to take such actions as are directed in the future in retaliation for this terrorist act, a series of terrorist acts unprecedented in world history. We call upon the entire world to step up and help, because terrorism is a common enemy to all, and we're in this together. The United States has borne the brunt, but who can be next? Step forward and let us hold accountable and punish those that have perpetrated this attack. Again, I commend the Secretary, the Chairman, and how proud we are. We spoke with our President here moments ago. He's got a firm grip on this situation, and the Secretary and the General have a firm grip on our armed forces and in communication of the world over.
Thank you very much. We'll take a few questions and then we'll adjourn. Charlie.
Mr. Secretary, did you have any inkling at all in any way that something of this nature and something of this scope might be planned?
Charlie, we don't discuss intelligence matters.
I see. And how would you respond if you find out who did this?
Obviously, the President of the United States has spoken on that subject, and those are issues that he will address in good time.
Mr.
Yes.
Secretary, we are getting reports from CNN and others that there are bombs exploding in Kabul, Afghanistan. Are we at the moment striking back, and if so, is the target Osama bin Laden and his organization?
I've seen those reports. They, in no way is the United States government connected to those explosions.
What about Osama bin Laden? Do you suspect him as the prime suspect in this?
It's not the time for discussions like that.
Mr. Secretary, you said you could not be specific about casualties. Can you give us some characterization of whether it's dozens or hundreds in the building?
Well, we know there were large number, many dozens in the aircraft that flew at full power, steering directly into between, I think, the first and second floor of the opposite the helipad. You've seen it. There cannot be any survivors. It just would be beyond comprehension. There are a number of people that they've not identified by name, but identified as being dead, and there are a number of casualties. But the FBI has secured the site, and the information takes time to come. People have been lifted out and taken away in ambulances, and the numbers will be calculated, and it will not be a few.
Mr. Secretary, could you tell us what you saw?
Mr. Secretary, do you consider what happened today, both in New York and here, an act of war?
There is no question but that the attack against the United States of America today was a vicious, well-coordinated, massive attack against the United States of America. What words the lawyers will use to characterize it is for them.
Does that mean that the U.S. is at war then?
Mr. Secretary, you said that the Pentagon would be open for business tomorrow. What kind of assurances can you give the people who work here at the building that the building will be safe?
A terrorist can attack at any time, at any place, using any technique. It is physically impossible to defend at every time, in every place, against every technique. It is not possible to give guarantees. The people who work in this building do so voluntarily. They're brave people, and they do their jobs well.
Mr. Secretary, can you give a sense of what happened? What did you see when you left your office, ran down to the site, and apparently helped people on stretchers and then returned to the command center?
I felt the shock of the airplane hitting the building, went through the building and then out into the area, and they were bringing bodies out that had been injured, most of which were alive and moving, but seriously injured. And a lot of volunteers were doing a terrific job helping to bring them out of the buildings and get them into stretchers and into ambulances and into airlifts.
Mr. Secretary, can you tell us how many of the dead were soldiers and how many were civilians? Have you been able to determine that?
Absolutely not.
Yes.
Mr. Secretary, today we saw military planes both in New York and in Washington. How much more of a military presence will we see now that this incident has occurred for the next week?
Those kinds of decisions are made day to day. It is correct that we had aircraft flying protective missions at various places in the United States today, and they will do that as appropriate.
Mr. Secretary, what do you say to the American people who may have questions on how something so coordinated has been carried out against this nation? What do you say to them who might not have confidence that our intelligence and our security are what they should be?
I say to them that the President of the United States will be making some remarks to them this evening that will address those subjects.
Mr. Secretary, you've declared, the Pentagon has declared threat con delta forces around the world. Could you tell me why? Have you received any threats, or has anyone claimed credit for this?
We have, in fact, declared force protection condition delta and a condition of high alert, indeed the highest alert. We did so almost immediately upon the attacks, and it is still in force.
Mr. Secretary, were there threats issued against other U.S. facilities elsewhere in the world today?
I don't know that there's a day that's gone by since I've been in this job that there haven't been threats somewhere in the world to some facility somewhere. It's one of the complexities of the intelligence business that you have to sort through those.
As we continue to listen to Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld, we are looking at Marine One now arriving on the south lawn of the White House carrying President Bush, arriving in Washington by way of Barksdale Air Force Base, Louisiana, after leaving Florida, then to Offutt Air Force Base in Nebraska, and now finally back to Washington, where he'll address the nation in about 2 hours from now. NBC's Bob Kerr is at the White House. Bob? Bob Kerr?
I don't know if you can hear me because it's obviously very noisy. The president arriving right now at the south lawn of the White House. This was a flight that he took from Andrews Air Force Base after a flight from an Air Force facility in Nebraska, where Air Force One was accompanied back to Washington, to Andrews Air Force Base, with a fighter jet escort on each wing. That's unusual, but obviously appropriate for the day. The president landing now on a south lawn where there was tonight supposed to be a picnic, a barbecue for members of Congress put on by the White House. Dozens of picnic tables have been moved off the lawn onto the driveway here. There is, of course, a stage still set. It's the stage from which President Bush was going to start, and there was going to be some entertainment here on the south lawn. Instead, the president will go directly to the Oval Office, which I can see now is bustling with various aides and technicians who are setting up for the president's speech to the nation later tonight. There is word from Ari Fleischer, the president's press secretary, who said that earlier today, the president, when he briefed his national security advisors, said, and I quote, "We will find these people, and they will suffer the consequences of taking on this nation. We will do what it takes. No one will diminish the spirit of this country." Those remarks, we are told, the president made to his national security advisors in a telephone conference meeting around 3:30 or 3:45 Eastern Time this afternoon. Another unusual thing about this arrival on the South Lawn, it's a usual thing to see him come in by helicopter, and there is almost always at least one other helicopter nearby, often carrying others or serving as a decoy. In this case, I think I counted 4, possibly 5 helicopters that came in before the president, circled around, went various directions, obviously decoyed. There's President Bush arriving back at the White House, obviously an image this administration wants to project, an image that does not suggest fear in returning to what is the people's house, the seat of the United States government. President Bush, rather grim face, walking across the lawn.
And as we look at the President of the United States, we just have to reflect for a moment how much our world has changed in the last 10 hours. This morning, this is a president who woke up with education on his mind, trying to figure out how to avoid dipping into Social Security surplus funds, and now he is dealing with an attack on America. 2 attacks, one in New York, 2 buildings attacked in New York, and of course the Pentagon. The president will be addressing the nation in about 2 hours from now, arriving here from Nebraska, where he had briefly set up headquarters at the National Military Headquarters there, the underground facility, secure facility there, but now back at the White House to take command. We should note that former President Bill Clinton is among those, former President Clinton in Australia, saying that America needs to unite behind this president. As we watch that horrible picture again of the 767 plunging into the World Trade Center, former President Clinton saying America needs to unite behind President Bush, that this is not a time for politics. It is a time to look to our leaders to guide us to this very dark hour in American history. These again were the pictures from New York City, both towers of the World Trade Center when they were standing, when they were aflame after the attacks. It would not be much longer before they would be a heap of rubble. And now you see in this live picture the smoke that has been billowing from lower Manhattan for much of the day. We heard Donald Rumsfeld a short time ago talking about the situation of the Pentagon, also attacked by a hijacked airplane today, and noting that there will be a considerable loss of life from that attack as well. We have no casualty figures right now, only in generalities, but it is a safe bet that this has extracted a deadly toll on America. It is 7 o'clock on the East Coast. This is live NBC News coverage on MSNBC of the attack on America. I'm Lester Holt, taking you through the next hour here. The Pentagon concluding the news conference a short time ago. Donald Rumsfeld and some of the congressional leadership also talking about the tragedy, talking about the fact that America will not stand by. The General Hugh Shelton, head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, saying, make no mistake about it, your armed forces are ready. What does that mean in terms of tomorrow or the next day? They don't want to talk about it. In New York City, at least 2,100 people we know injured. The death toll is very sketchy at this hour right now. There is so much rubble still burning in New York City right now. There are calls for blood donations in New York. If you are familiar with Manhattan, the area below 14th Street shut down right now, and then there again. And each time you see it, it sends a chill up your spine. This huge jetliner loaded with people deliberately crashing into the World Trade Center, and the deliberateness of that plane being guided leads many experts to believe the pilots were not in charge of that airplane, but a terrorist pilot had taken the controls and made that suicidal plunge. We are joined on the phone by, or actually live, by a very patient former Secretary of State Warren Christopher. Secretary Christopher, thank you for standing by during all this time. I'd like you, if you could, to address what we just heard from Donald Rumsfeld.
Well, I thought that it was a very competent, calm performance by Secretary Rumsfeld, characteristic of him. I thought that it was reassuring to hear that we had not launched attacks at the present time. It's too early to do that in all probability. You can understand why we have the incentive to do that, but I think we need to be calm, study this through, find out who the real culprits are, and then go after them very hard. I thought that Secretary Rumsfeld was wise not to try to project as to what we are going to do in the future, because the United States will want to have the maximum surprise when we do take the action that we probably will have to take in the future. But I'd say again how important it is for us not to jump to conclusions here. Quite often the first judgment you make is the wrong judgment. Osama bin Laden is obviously one of the key suspects. On the other hand, this looks too big to me to be done by a single person, even with a wealthy network. I think it's very important we address not only the immediate perpetrators, but who stands behind this, who supported it. Were there other countries who were either condoning it or supporting it? That's where we need to go if we're to get some ultimate relief.
Mr. Secretary, are you suggesting this might be, in fact, state-sponsored terrorism?
I think it may well be state-supported terrorism in some way. The pattern here is for the terrorists to do their plotting in one country, carry out their act in a second country, and then flee to a third country. And what I hope for in this situation is we will not do what we did in the Khobar Towers bombing in Saudi Arabia, and that is just focus on the immediate perpetrators, but we go deeper, drill down, and to find out who actually was behind this.
Mr. Secretary, we're also joined in this conversation now by former Defense Secretary Bill Cohen of the Clinton administration. Secretary Cohen, thank you for joining us this evening. Pleasure. I want to ask to both of you, and I'll start with you, Secretary Cohen. Americans, I think I can safely say, want two things. We want justice, and we want to know that we'll be safe walking the streets of our cities tomorrow. How difficult will the latter be to convince Americans that they are safe, Secretary Cohen?
Well, I think President Bush tonight will certainly call for calm and to assure the American people that everything that can be done will be done to provide maximum protection possible, consistent with an open democratic society. This monumental tragedy is going to cause us to have an internal debate, which is perhaps long overdue, in terms of how we reconcile the competing interests of providing protection to the American people and defending their interests, at the same time providing protection for their civil liberties. This is the challenge that terrorism is going to present to all of us. And so I think this has been what I would call a life-transforming experience for the American people. Our lives have been changed fundamentally in terms of how we look at the world, how we see the threat of terrorism, and how we intend to respond to it.
Secretary Cohen, we talked a moment ago about the call for justice. During the Clinton administration, the U.S. launched cruise missile attacks following the twin embassy bombings in Africa. In hindsight, were those ill-advised? Were we too quick on the trigger? Should we react differently in this case?
No, I don't think we were too quick on the trigger with respect to responding to a terrorist training operation. And we had information, for example, that Osama bin Laden and his followers were planning more follow-up suicide bombings against our installations both abroad and here at home. We also had information that he was trying to acquire access to a weapon of mass destruction. And we took preemptive action in terms of going after a so-called pharmaceutical plant in Sudan. So I think that we acted very carefully and judiciously, and I think we have to do the same thing here. Find out who is behind it. I agree with Secretary Warren Christopher. Find out who is supporting it. Go after those countries who provide safe harbor and safe transportation and moral and as well as financial support for these types of activities. This cannot be done by the United States alone. It has to be done on a multilateral basis, and that's why we're calling upon all of our friends to support the United States in this hour of need, because what happens here will affect every one of our friends abroad. If we are wounded, the rest of the world bleeds as well, because if we have to change our way of life and living and shut down certain activities, that's going to have a major impact on all those that we do business with. So this is something that we're all in this together. Here at home, all Americans are in it together, much as we were following the attack on Pearl Harbor, but also all of our friends are in this with us, and they have to be.
Let me put it to Secretary Christopher. How do we change, if at all, our approach to the Middle East, specifically the peace process in Israel?
Well, we're not sure that these are linked, but they certainly have the earmarks of being linked. These suicide bombers sound very much like some of the suicide bombers in Israel. But I think that it's important for us to try to understand that all around the world there are desperate people, and we need to pull up our socks and get up our guard here in the United States to prevent them interfering with our lives in the way they have today. Everything will date from today. We really are in a completely new situation. This is a defining moment for the United States. We have to be careful to do it within our constitutional processes. But as someone said, the Constitution is not a suicide pact, and we need to find ways to deal with both the intelligence and security issues that are so well defined by this particular incident.
Does that mean, in your opinion, that Americans are going to have to give something up in terms of freedoms to deal with this kind of tragedy and prevent it from happening again?
They'll certainly have to give up something in terms of convenience. They're going to have a lot more security around their airports. How these four groups could have gotten through 3, probably 4 airports in the United States without being detected and gotten onto the plane and taken over those planes is an undefined story, an untold story. We'll be hearing it over the next several days and weeks. We may learn something from that, but unquestionably we're going to have to give up some of our convenience, perhaps even give up some of our courtesy in order to try to make Americans feel that they're safe again. We all probably have personalized this in some way. This is a very personal tragedy to so many people in the United States.
In fact, it is, and many of us in New York feel that we will likely know someone there. And Secretary Cohen, you, of course, Pentagon was where you went to work every day. Describe on a personal level what it was like to see that building so vulnerable today.
Well, it was a nightmare that I and all of my predecessors no doubt shared, that we would one day witness an attack upon the Pentagon because of the vulnerability, because of the proximity to the airport, because we know that that's a nerve center of our military capability in terms of organization at least. And it was a tragedy that it struck right in the very pit of my soul. This was a monstrous evil that was perpetrated upon the American people, and to see some of the people that I worked so closely with caught in that rubble, caught in that tremendous inferno over there, it struck home in a way that is very personal, as you said.
Can only imagine. Secretary Cohen, Secretary Christopher, gentlemen, we do appreciate you taking the time this evening and speaking with us.
Thank you.
The effects on America have certainly been immediate and profound. Airports across the country remain shut down. The FAA says they will remain shut down until at least noon tomorrow. Planes were ordered to land as soon as they could when it became apparent that there were planes being hijacked. This is a live picture you're watching now as sunset begins to shine its rosy glow on the New York City skyline, but much of that skyline obscured, as it has been all day, by the continuing plume of smoke. What is left of the World Trade Center continuing to burn right now, and Lower Manhattan virtually cut off right now below 14th Street. If you're familiar with the area, that basically takes you all the way from Greenwich Village all the way down to the Battery. Speaking now of the airports, NBC's Shelley Smith is at the Los Angeles International Airport, one of the busiest airports in the country, but like every airport now, a virtual ghost town. What's the story there, Shelley?
That's right, Lester. Well, we just received a news briefing from the special agent in charge of the FBI as well as the chief of the airport police. They tell us that LAX will remain closed until the FAA says it is safe to open. So when that will be is still uncertain, although United Airlines has just issued a release saying that its planes will remain on the ground until noon tomorrow Central Time. We were also told that the last flight to arrive here in LA was at 11:30 this morning. It was an international flight. No more flights are scheduled to arrive today. We were also told by the head of the FBI that there have been no direct threats against this airport or any other airport in the western region. Now, I have to tell you that we were actually forced to evacuate LAX about 2 hours ago. There was a brief scare when FBI agents found a suspicious package in the lower level of the parking structure directly across from American Airlines, and so they moved all of the press about a quarter of a mile down, brought in a bomb squad to check the package out, and then we were given the all clear and told to leave. This airport, as you said, is one of the busiest. It is the third largest in the nation. 2,200 planes fly in and out of here every day, but I can tell you it looks like a ghost town. I have never seen the airport look like this. There are no flights going in, no flights going out. The FBI has been here all day with bomb-sniffing dogs. They are going through every inch of that airport, as well as the planes that were left on the tarmac. The planes were actually taxied away from the terminal, but they are going through each and every plane. But they tell us that they believe that LAX is secure, but no word yet on when flights will resume here. That's the latest from Los Angeles. Lester?
Shelley Smith. Shelley, thank you. And of course, Los Angeles figures prominently in this whole story. 3 of the 4 hijacked planes were bound for Los Angeles, 2 Boston, LA. Those ended up hitting the World Trade Centers in New York. The other plane was going from Washington Dulles Airport to Los Angeles. and was involved in the attack on the Pentagon. So the Boston-Los Angeles connection very prominent in this investigation. While Shelley was speaking, you may have seen in the video box there another airplane, a small airplane flying. That was a live picture of a fighter jet here in the New York area. Folks don't see fighter planes very often, perhaps during Fleet Week, air shows in the area, but all day long we have seen what appear to be Air Force and Navy interceptors, fighter jets patrolling the skies here. In wartime, this would be called combat air patrol. We are not at war, although some folks may say this is a declared war. We just don't know declared by whom. At any event, these planes enforcing what is essentially the no-fly zone of the entire United States right now. All airports shut down, and it is presumed that any airplane flying now would have to be considered having hostile intentions. Now, how is this going to play out tomorrow and the next day and the next day? We don't know. The Pentagon briefing only suggested it would be a day-by-day decision. We know that aircraft carriers have been moved up the East Coast, off the northeast coast of the United States, presumably to function in the combat air patrol function, looking for hostile airplanes. This is something U.S. military planes traditionally in our past, especially during the Cold War, have been really geared toward threats coming across the oceans aimed towards the U.S. Never before have they been put in a position where American airplanes, commercial airplanes, could be thought of in a hostile nature. Again, the FAA says planes will be grounded until at least noon tomorrow. What the game plan will be is the big question, and the question, of course, is what will America's confidence be? We may get some sense of how Americans will feel, what confidence we have that our leaders are going to take care of us and prevent this from happening again. President George W. Bush will be addressing the nation. We were told that was coming at 9 o'clock Eastern time. We're now told there is a schedule change, but we can't tell you when. So we invite you to stay right here as we continue to wait for the president. He arrived a short time ago in Washington, D.C., and arrived on Marine One at the White House just a few minutes ago. We can tell you, in fact, we'll play for you what the president said earlier about this attack on America.
Oh, another one just hit. Something else just hit. A very large plane just flew directly over my building, and there's been another collision. Went straight into one of the Twin Towers. It just disintegrated instantly. It was the most awful thing I've ever seen.
Today, we've had a national tragedy.
As terrible a day as this is for us, we will get through it because we are a strong nation, a nation that believes in itself.
Make no mistake, the United States will hunt down and punish those responsible for these cowardly acts.
They can destroy buildings, they can kill people, and we will be saddened by this tragedy, but they will never be allowed to kill the spirit of democracy.
Terrorism against our nation will not stand. May God bless the victims, their families, and America.
And this is a live picture. This from the Pentagon right now as some flames continue to burn there following the attack today. A news conference, we're told, about to get underway momentarily. Attorney General John Ashcroft, another cabinet member, Tommy Thompson, HEW, Health and Human Services. Here's John Ashcroft now about to address reporters at the White House.
Today, America has experienced one of the greatest tragedies ever witnessed on our soil. These heinous acts of violence are an assault on the security of our nation. They are an assault on the security and the freedom of every American citizen. We will not tolerate such acts. We will expend every effort and devote all the necessary resources to bring the people responsible for these acts, these crimes, to justice. Now is the time for us to come together as a nation to offer our support, our prayers for victims and for their families, for the rescue workers, for law enforcement officials, for every one of us that has been changed forever by this horrible tragedy. The following is a summary of the known facts surrounding today's incidents. American Airlines Flight 11 departed Boston for Los Angeles, hijacked by suspects armed with knives. This plane crashed into the World Trade Center. United Airlines Flight 175 departed Boston for Los Angeles, was hijacked and crashed into the World Trade Center. American Airlines Flight 77 departed Washington Dulles for Los Angeles, was hijacked and crashed into the Pentagon. United Airlines Flight 93 departed Newark for San Francisco, was hijacked and crashed in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. Crime scenes have been established by the federal authorities in New York, in Washington, D.C. area, in Pittsburgh, in Boston, and in Newark. The full resources of the Department of Justice, including the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the Immigration and Naturalization Service, the U.S. Attorney's offices, the U.S. Marshals Service, the Bureau of Prisons, the Drug Enforcement Administration, and the Office of Justice Programs are being deployed to investigate these crimes and to assist survivors and victim families. Thousands of FBI agents in all of the field offices across the country and in the international legat offices, assisted by personnel from other Department of Justice agencies, are cooperating in this investigation. The FBI has established a website where people can report any information about these crimes. That address is www.ifccfbi.gov. That address again, www.ifccfbi.gov. Individuals can report any information they know about these crimes to that website. It takes courage for individuals to come forward in situations like this, and I urge anyone with information that may be useful and helpful to authorities to use this opportunity. The Office of Victims of Crime has established a toll-free 800 number for family and friends of victims. They can call 800-331-0075 to leave contact information for a future time when more information is available, to find out information about a victim, or to find out information about the rights of victims and the services available to victim survivors and victim families. The determination of these terrorists will not deter the determination of the American people. We are survivors, and freedom is a survivor. A free American people will not be intimidated, nor will we be defeated. We will find the people responsible for these cowardly acts, and justice will be done. Tommy.
Every single American lost something today. And every one of us at this time expresses our deepest sympathy to the victims of today's tragedies and their families. It is now our mission to begin the healing from this tragedy. From the moment that we learned of these attacks, the Department of Health and Human Services has begun readying teams and resources to be sent to New York City and the Washington area to meet any needs of state and local officials. So far, we have sent 4 disaster medical teams to New York City, and 3 of these disaster medical teams to the Washington, Northern Virginia, Baltimore area. These medical teams each consist of about 35 physicians, nurses, and emergency medical technicians. They are all trained to deal with traumatic injuries and other emergency needs. We've also sent 4 disaster mortuary operational response teams to New York and 3 to the greater Washington area. We're also in the process of shipping a great deal of emergency medical supplies to New York City with the help of the Centers for Disease Control. In short, We're making the full force of the Department of Health and Human Services, both its resources and medical expertise available to the areas that need our assistance. We've also this afternoon activated the United States Public Health Service Commission Corps, which consists of approximately 6,000 health professionals. We also are giving backup assistance to the 500-bed ship Comfort from the United States Navy. Americans all over are calling up and asking what they can do. The best thing they can do is respond to this great call by volunteering to give blood. We need Americans to continue to answer that call. No matter where you live, please do your civic duty and assist us by donating blood. It is our primary job is to make sure Americans harmed by this tragedy get the help that they need. We will remain in constant contact with the governors, the mayors, public health officials, and other local officials to make sure that all their needs are being met. It is a sad day, but America and all of its citizens certainly share tonight in the grief that it's caused. And as the President and everybody in his administration have said, we, the government, will continue to operate and continue to provide the services to all Americans.
One of the most cherished freedoms is the freedom of movement, the ability to move freely and safely. But today that freedom was attacked. But we will restore
As we hear from members of the President's cabinet on the right of your screen, the congressional leadership about to hold a news conference of their own. We should note a bit of news made by John Ashcroft there, the first confirmation of the weapons involved in the American flight hijacked. He said the suspects, plural, were armed with knives. Here's Speaker of the House Denny Hastert now addressing reporters in Washington. Let's listen to that.
We're a part of this great tragedy that happened in this country today. Our prayers and thoughts and words of consolation goes out to all those who have suffered. But one thing that happens here in this place is when American suffers and when people perpetrate acts against this country, we as a Congress and as a government stand united, and we stand together. Senators and House members, Democrats and Republicans will stand shoulder to shoulder to fight this evil that's been perpetrated on this nation. We will stand together to make sure that those who have brought forth this evil deed will pay the price. We're not sure who this is yet. But we have our suspicions. And when that is justified and when those suspicions are justified, we will act. We will stand with the President, we will stand with this government, and we will stand as Americans together through this time. Thank you.
Today's despicable acts were an assault on our people and on our freedom. As the representatives of the people, we are here to declare that our resolve has not been weakened by these horrific and cowardly acts. Congress will convene tomorrow. And we will speak with one voice to condemn these attacks, to comfort the victims and their families, to commit our full support to the effort to bring those responsible to justice. We, Republicans and Democrats, House and Senate, stand strongly united behind the President and will work together to ensure that the full resources of the government are brought to bear in these efforts. Our heartfelt thoughts and our fervent prayers are with the injured and the families of those who have been lost.
We know as a nation, as we said, our thoughts and prayers are with those families and those injured and those who are the casualties of today's attack. We also remember those thousands of people who are rescue workers. We ask now that we all bow our heads in a moment of silence and remembrance. Thank you.
Darkness is now falling on New York City, and the smoke continues to rise. Part of lower Manhattan still ablaze, the rubble covering countless numbers of bodies, and the news that we have feared and we knew we would hear, we are beginning to get some startling, overwhelming numbers. This is from Associated Press, the first estimate of the dead victims in the Trade Center collapse. In the words of the writer, scary. A vice president with the New York City Firefighters Union says half of the 400 firefighters who reached the scene may be dead. Congressional leadership now singing God Bless America.
My home, sweet home. God bless America. My home, sweet home.
Politics may eventually rear its head in all of this, but for now, a true symbol of unity, of bipartisanship on Capitol Hill. America rallying around President Bush, who will have to lead us through this difficult time. Former President Clinton among those who has said it is time to turn to the president and support him and to put politics aside. And we just heard that joint news conference from the congressional leadership. But as we watch this live picture over New York, again, we're getting some of the first estimates, and we fear it will become much worse than this. But a member of the Firefighters Union in New York City says half of the 400 firefighters who first reached the scene may be dead. He says we're going to have to bury a lot of people. The Cardinal, the Archbishop of New York City, Cardinal Edward Egan, administered last rites to dozens of victims. He said firefighters and police were dead in great numbers. An emergency medical service worker, Luis Garcia, said initial reports indicate the bodies buried beneath the 2 feet of soot on streets around the Trade Center. And this is difficult to say. Garcia says a lot of the vehicles are running over bodies because they are all over the place. And it is just the beginning of the news that we fear we will continue to hear with greater frequency. At about 7 o'clock Eastern Time, crews began heading into Ground Zero of the terrorist attack to begin the search for survivors and the recovery of the bodies. Here was some of the video from one of the building collapses. I'm not sure if this was from one of the main towers. Apparently it was, and you saw people running for their lives. First one of the Trade Center towers, then another, and then later as evening approached, the number 7 building, World Trade number 7, one that not familiar to those outside of New York, it also collapsed. New York City hospitals overwhelmed with the injured today. Over 2,000 people have already sought help. NBC's Monica Novotny now with a live report. Monica?
We have the latest numbers from St. Vincent's. They came out just a few moments ago. Let me read them off to you. Right now, St. Vincent's has 319 victims. 50 to 55 of those are in critical condition. 45 of the 319 are rescue workers. We've heard this story throughout the day. We've seen many of the firefighters, the policemen, the EMS coming in. They are covered in soot. They are suffering from various kinds of smoke inhalation. Apparently the concrete dust that is in that area where they have been digging, where they have been working, has been very damaging to the lungs, and of course all of the smoke inhalations as well. After Building 7 went down, they told us that area was declared a hot zone. They pulled out as many of the rescue workers as they could, and apparently the digging has stopped there. Now, we haven't gotten word as to whether or not the digging has begun again. Perhaps you might have heard that. We don't have that information here, but they have said that the emergency medical crews were not going to go in until that hot zone had been opened up to them. We also have heard they've had about 6 ambulances going down throughout the day, 6 crews of ambulances, several actual cars of ambulances. One of those was crushed in the second explosion. However, luckily, some crew members were actually in that ambulance. We also want to let you know Governor Pataki was just here visiting the hospital less than an hour ago. He came in first and took hands with all of the medical crew that are still outside here waiting for more victims to be brought in. He thanked the folks. He then went inside the hospital. Apparently, he spoke to some of the victims there. He came out and talked to the press afterwards. He said he did speak to the victims. He said their stories are moving. Thank God they're here. As far as the rescue goes, again, he also, referring to that hot zone, talked about it being an incredibly dangerous situation still. However, according to the governor, everything that can be done is being done. He also said that he is confident that the terrorists will not have the last word. Lester, back to you.
Monica Novotny in New York City, and we can't overemphasize how difficult it must be for families, for people who just have no contact with their loved ones who may have been in Lower Manhattan today when disaster struck. Telephone service has been very difficult. Cell phone service virtually non-existent in many places. And here's the video that chills us to the bone again at 7:67, purposely aimed into the World Trade Center. And this is going to be one of the last times in this video that we see those 2 buildings standing, albeit in flames, because it wouldn't be long after that both would be in a pile of rubble in the streets of Lower Manhattan. There's the view, darkness falling over New York, and that gray haze of smoke still rising from the rubble. I am told now that President Bush is going to be addressing the nation in just a little less than an hour at 8:30 Eastern Time. We will, of course, carry that for you live. President Bush, 8:30 Eastern Time. I want to also let you know U.S. officials telling NBC News that the aircraft carrier USS Enterprise, which just left the Persian Gulf, has been ordered to stay where it is in the Indian Ocean and not go any further away from the Gulf. There is another carrier battle group, the USS Carl Vinson, already in the Gulf. We won't try to read into that, but let you know that the U.S. will maintain a steady presence in the Gulf. And we had learned earlier aircraft carriers moving up to the northeast coast of the United States in a protective mode to presumably run more of those fighter patrols that we have seen in the skies over New York City and Washington, D.C. today. The World Trade Center was the home, or is the home, of the New York, New Jersey Port Authority, the bi-state agency that runs the Hudson River crossings, as well as all 3 New York area airports. One of the planes hijacked had originated at Newark Airport, just across the river from Manhattan. And joining me now is the acting governor of New Jersey, Donald DeFrancisco. Governor, thank you for being with us. Give us your thoughts if you can.
Well, I'm very sad, and this is such a tragedy. It's hard to believe that this could happen. We have so many friends and family that work in those buildings. My kids, our friends are trying to frantically find out just what happened and who's survived, who's missing, are people safe. And as you said, communications are very difficult. Transportation is very difficult. We've been prepared to help in whatever way we can. I've talked to Governor Pataki several times today. We've reached out to Mayor Giuliani. They're doing a great job in New York, as you've already indicated. Their rescue teams, it's just such a difficult situation. I was just at Liberty State Park, which is on the other side of the river.
It's on the New Jersey side.
On the New Jersey side, with surgeons, with medical people, hundreds of vehicles ready to transport people, waiting for people to be ferried over so that we could treat them and help them and feed them and do whatever had to be done.
Governor, let me ask you, we know that the Hudson River crossings were shut down as a precaution immediately after this tragedy began to unfold today. We understand they are open now, and there's a mass exodus of people leaving New York City and coming into your state. Tell me what that presents.
Well, we were concerned about gridlock because we wanted people to get out freely, so we did declare a state of emergency to allow the state police to close down roads if they see fit. For example, roads going towards the Holland Tunnel, the Turnpike particularly, is closed. But going towards the George Washington Bridge, it's open, it's gridlock right now, I was just on it. Coming out of the city, it's moving very well.
And are you getting people from the shore, from the Hudson to their homes? Transit working?
Well, PATH was closed, of course, at that time.
We should let people know that PATH is a subway service that runs from New York into New Jersey.
Right. PATH, the subway service was closed. The transit was closed from New York. Everything was immediately closed down. So there are trains that can operate and move people, but it really was shut down immediately, and so it was very difficult to get out.
Governor, I don't know how many people live in the metropolitan area, maybe 15, 20, 25 million people, but in listening to people today, it becomes a very small town. When, I know somebody that works in the World Trade Center. I have a friend, I have a son, a daughter. It's striking very close to home very quickly.
I can't tell you how many people, whether they be state police or medical people, who said to me, oh, God, they called, and I called my son, I called my daughter, they're okay, they were worried about him. We've gotten a lot of that because you're right, there's a lot of people here, but it is close to home. New Jersey, New York, we share that, those facilities really. So many people transport themselves to New York from New Jersey. We're praying. We're just hopeful that it isn't the tragedy we suspect it might be.
I know that the state does not directly run Newark Airport. Newark Airport was the origination of one of the planes that the one that ultimately crashed in Pennsylvania. It is John Ashcroft, the Attorney General, told us in at least one of the hijacked airplanes, one from Boston, the suspects were armed with knives. We've got to wonder how Americans are going to walk to Newark Airport or any airport in America tomorrow, assuming flights resume, and feel safe.
It certainly is going to change our attitude. It's going to be very difficult to deal with. We're going to hear a lot more tomorrow, much more than we heard today. Of this tragedy. It's going to be worse as the next few days as we listen to the stories of the survivors, but we also find out about the people who didn't survive.
You're saying we need to brace ourselves.
Oh yeah, I think it's going to get worse. Yeah.
Governor DeFrancesco, thank you for taking the time out. We do appreciate it. And again, we are just, we have known throughout the day when we saw those buildings collapse, we knew that the death toll and the casualty rate was going to be so high. But as we reported a time ago, the fire department union in New York City believes that as many as 200, and that's a rough estimate, but based on the number of missing fire companies, we may have already lost 200 firefighters in this, and who knows how many civilians were not able to make it out of those buildings before they came tumbling down. NBC's Joe Johns is in Washington, D.C., where a short time ago we witnessed perhaps the truest example we may ever see of bipartisanship, the congressional leadership gathering together and making their statements in wake of this tragedy. Joe, tell us about it.
Clearly an attempt here, Lester, to try to make a statement in this very long day for the nation. Here on Capitol Hill, as you know, a number of members of Congress spirited away, actually, as part of a plan to protect them in the event of an attack on the nation, which this, in fact, was. And as you said just moments ago, the congressional leadership coming here to the Capitol, the plaza outside the Capitol, the front steps, to say, number one, that Congress will be in session tomorrow, and also to talk about their concerns for the victims of this tragedy. Let's hear from the Speaker of the House and the Majority Leader of the Senate.
We will stand together to make sure that those who have brought forth this evil deed will pay the price. We're not sure who this is yet. But we have our suspicions. And when that is justified, and when those suspicions are justified, we will act. We will stand with the president, we will stand with this government, and we will stand as Americans together through this time.
Today's despicable acts were an assault on our people and on our freedom. As the representatives of the people, we are here to declare that our resolve has not been weakened by these horrific and cowardly acts. Congress will convene tomorrow.
With me right now, Congressman Brian Baird of Washington State. You, as many members did this morning, had an interesting perspective, partially because of the view from the window of your office. Could you tell us a little bit about what you saw, considering the fact that you can see the Pentagon from your 7th floor office here on Capitol Hill?
We had been watching the coverage in New York and were as appalled and aghast as everyone, and I thought we need to take precautions here, because if they're that coordinated in New York, there could be an attack here. I called my entire staff in and said, we need to review our exit strategy. We need to be absolutely clear if something happens. We're out of this building quickly. Maybe a minute later, my staff was looking out the window and said, you know, there are not supposed to be any airplanes in the air, but there's an airplane. She looked and said, hey, everybody, there's an airplane out here. What's going on? The next minute, she looked out the window and said, my God, it hit the Pentagon. We ran out, saw the smoke from the Pentagon. I told my whole staff to get out of there, out of the 7th floor Longworth. I stayed in the building and notified every other member, because for all we knew at that moment, another attack could hit our building, and seconds could really matter.
And fortunately, it did not. That is one, of course, of the many stories here on Capitol Hill. We'll certainly be hearing many more, certainly from those people who were closer to the scene there at the Pentagon. Lester, back to you.
All right, Joe Johns on Capitol Hill. Joe, thank you very much. And again, a senior U.S. official is saying that the U.S. 90% certain that Osama bin Laden responsible for today's attack. And you heard the Speaker of the House say they have a pretty good idea who did this. He did not specify, but only said a pretty good idea. We got our latest and so far our best account of the moment-by-moment occurrences today, beginning with that first crash at the World Trade Center, from Attorney General John Ashcroft, who addressed reporters just a short time ago. Here's the Attorney General's account.
The following is a summary of the known facts surrounding today's incidents. American Airlines Flight 11 departed Boston for Los Angeles, hijacked by suspects armed with knives. This plane crashed into the World Trade Center. United Airlines Flight 175 departed Boston for Los Angeles, was hijacked and crashed into the World Trade Center. American Airlines Flight 77 departed Washington Dulles for Los Angeles, was hijacked and crashed into the Pentagon. United Airlines Flight 93 departed Newark for San Francisco, was hijacked and crashed in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. Crime scenes have been established by the federal authorities in New York, in Washington, D.C. area, in Pittsburgh, in Boston, and in Newark.
Attorney General John Ashcroft, a short time ago, a live view of the New York City skyline. Darkness has fallen now, but we can tell you smoke continues to rise from lower Manhattan, the rubble of the World Trade Center. John Ashcroft, for the first time, giving us a little bit more about what may have gone on in the cockpits, noting that suspects, as in plural, were armed with knives on that American Flight 11 from Boston to Los Angeles, one of the planes that struck the trade towers. Any American who has had to undergo a hand search through airport security because of a pocket pen or their eyeglass case has got to be shaking their heads in bewilderment that these suspects were apparently got on board with knives. We know that apparently to be the case in at least one of the hijacked airplanes. This story unfolded so quickly this morning. It was a little bit before 9 o'clock here on the East Coast, and we got word here in the newsroom of what sounded like a horrible accident, but an accident, a plane crashing into the World Trade Center. We all watched this story unfold live as it became much, much more than that, an attack on America. Here are some of the sights and sounds of a morning none of us will ever forget.
There's another one. I'm taking a look. Oh my God! Oh my God!
Oh, another one just hit. Something else just hit. A very large plane just flew directly over my building, and there's been another collision. Went straight into one of the Twin Towers. It just disintegrated instantly. It was the most awful thing I've ever seen.
It straightened itself out and dove to the other side and crashed right in. An explosion was so terrific, it looked like it had dynamite in it.
This is what is coming over our radio. Get out of the area. The second tower is coming down.
They tell you the second tower is coming down?
Yes, it's about to collapse.
I got fellow officers that might be trapped. I'm not trying to be a hero, but I think if you were in this position, you'd do the same thing.
But there were people falling out of the sky. We were trying to get people away when the second collapse occurred, and I dove under a truck, so I don't know how I'm here.
I spent a year in combat. I never saw anything like this.
After the first tower collapsed, we were back in there trying to bring people out. We knew the second one was about to come down, but we were lifting one person, and when it came down, we all just ran for our lives.
You could hear the rumbling. When you looked up, you could see the top of the building just crumbling. We all headed south, and you could feel the wind hitting in the back. Because as the debris hit.
Couldn't see, everything was totally black. You were just walking, hoping to find daylight. It was just unbelievable. I never seen anything like it in my life.
I'm just thinking about the firemen I see going up the stairs behind me and look at half of this building. I don't know.
Two 110 stories brought to the ground. World Trade number 7, a 47-story building brought to the ground. America, New York has absorbed some unbelievable news, and it is only going to get worse. We will be absorbing even worse news in the coming days. Police officer Tyrone Dux talking to AP from a triage center in Lower Manhattan. Quote, "New York is crying," said Dux himself in tears. And there it is. There's a picture of Lower Manhattan right now. All you can see is the grayness of the smoke, and there is a live picture from ground level in New York City. The city is virtually paralyzed. Some subway service, we're told, has resumed. There are no inbound tunnels or bridges. You can't get into New York right now, and the city is virtually blocked off below 14th Street. That's the beginning of Greenwich Village all the way south to the Battery. The numbers we have received throughout the day are sketchy. It is probably too horrible to even speculate as to what the total and final casualty figures will be. We do know that after the first plane hit the first #1 World Trade Center, there was a massive response of firefighters and rescuers. Little did they know a second plane would strike, and little did they know beyond that both of these towers would come crashing down. There are estimates from the head of the firefighters union here in New York City that as many as 200 firefighters may be dead, that there are entire fire department companies that have not been heard from. There are apparently feet and feet of rubble and dust in Lower Manhattan. We were told a little after 7 o'clock Eastern time about 50 minutes ago, rescuers began to work their way toward what everyone is referring to as Ground Zero in the search for what we hope will be survivors and what will most certainly be, in many cases, bodies. Former FBI investigator Cliff Van Sant is joining us now live from Washington. Cliff, thanks for joining us this evening.
Okay, thank you.
Where do you start? Where do you start to find the bad guys?
Well, you take a deep breath. This is one of these things that you have to keep focused, where from the FBI standpoint, is that they'll have to consider each individual crime scene. There's going to be a lot of emotional, psychological, and computer fingerprints on this. You don't have an operation with this many people involved, and yesterday these people are in the city, today they're gone. So the FBI is going to be fanning out. This is going to be an operation somewhat like during World War II, right after Pearl Harbor was bombed, when the FBI and law enforcement was immediately moving out and starting investigations. This is going to be the same way. There's been a tremendous loss of life, but the focus will be on the investigation, identifying the terrorist cells that supported this operation. There's going to be money trails to follow, people trails, internet calls, telephone calls. The FBI will be pursuing the investigation in this country and will resolve this in the courts. And the military, if necessary, will pursue it in their own way in other places.
Clint, the fact that this operation was so big, so well coordinated, and apparently, from all accounts, included a number of people, do you think this is going to be a rather easy one to track down and get to the source?
Well, it's not going to be easy. You know, we spent years in the FBI gaming out terrorist type of incidents. We usually found that we gave the terrorists far more credit than they were actually due. Like if you look at the attack on the USS Cole, as devastating and as tragic as it was a couple of guys in a rubber boat with explosives. That took months to plan. If you think of the months and the people and the money and the logistics that this would take, and there's probably 4 groups capable of pulling this off. Hezbollah, the nation states of Iran and Iraq, and everybody's favorite person to hate, Osama bin Laden. And that last individual/group is probably where most of us are putting our chips down. Iran and Iraq would be a little careful about doing something like this because they would not be as they would not provoke the United States in this way. Bin Laden has shown a history of provoking, and we're going to have to deal with him in the courts or some other way.
Clint, this apparently, by many accounts, we watched the precision of the way this plane dove into that tower. Many experts say it is clear that someone was, other than the regular airline pilot, was flying that airplane. Given that sort of expertise, are you leaning more toward a state-sponsored terrorist attack?
Well, we've known for a number of years that bin Laden has trained pilots that are within his group that are capable of flying/hijacking aircraft. So that still puts me in his camp for doing something like this. And then when you see the level of fanaticism that has to be there, and then you see at least one of the aircraft, the hijacking, we're told, took place using edged weapons, knives. This is something, again, that the group would have practiced for a number of months. What's the best way to get a knife on board an aircraft, should they have carried it? Now, we also have to look at, did they get support from any type of crew member, anyone working on the ground, the people at the metal detectors? But right now, there's probably ways that they researched over the months and find out how to get weapons on board the aircraft. All of that will come out as this investigation goes on.
Clint, give me your best guess as to what's happening right now. We know these flights originated in Boston, Washington, Dulles, and Newark. Give me the play-by-play as you imagine it in those first few hours after we realized we were under attack.
Well, this is always the shock value, unfortunately, hits us where we don't believe this is actually taking place. All of the networks were reporting the probability or possibility of an accident when the first aircraft hit the World Trade Center. When the second one hit, I think everyone started to realize, but we as a nation, and I think our response capability was still in shock. You know, this is one of the first times we've had to consider if we have a hijacked aircraft full of citizens diving at a location, and we have, such as at the White House, perhaps, the shoot-down ability, do we use Secret Service agents or the military to shoot down a U.S. aircraft full of our own people, or do we let that aircraft go where it's going to? So those decisions were being made, as well as, from my standpoint, the FBI was mustering its people all over the country. You know, I'm on an internet site that retired FBI agents are on, and I saw dozens of agents on that site today asking if they could volunteer their services to go into an FBI office and just handle administrative paperwork so that the current FBI agents could get out on the street and start investigating this. You know, that's something like World War II, old sailors coming out and saying, I'll get back on this aircraft carrier if it'll help win this war. I think that's the level of involvement it's going to take, because we have a war declared against the United States. We just don't have an island nation right now that we can strike back at.
Clint, if this is in fact a war, are the chains going to come off of law enforcement? Is the rule book going to get thrown away here, the gloves coming off?
What we don't want is to have terrorists reduce us to their level. If we start taking actions that are outside the Constitution, outside of law enforcement, they have won one more time. They've reduced us to their level. I think what you're going to see is the U.S. government, the FBI, and all the other investigative agencies pursue this very, very strongly. We have an idea who these people are in this country. They've hid behind the Constitution. They've hid behind the freedoms that we as Americans enjoy. But these terrorist groups, terrorist cells, we're going to identify them, and we're going to have to prosecute them in the courts. But we have to do it the right way, to take the gloves off, to say, okay, now we're going in with the nightsticks and taking names. Then we're no better than the people we're combating right now.
Clint, throughout the day we have heard comparisons to Pearl Harbor. We know in the wake of Pearl Harbor that hindsight was 20/20, that in fact all the signs were there of an attack. Do you think that's going to be the case here in the coming weeks? We're going to realize, like, oh yeah, we had this memo and this memo, and
well, you know, the challenge here is that every week that goes by, we get new terrorist warnings. We get bin Laden 3 weeks ago issuing threats. He's put out videos suggesting that everyone in the Islamic community attacked the United States. As late as last week, someone in bin Laden's organization called a London newspaper and indicated that they were going to attack U.S. entities. The State Department issued warnings as of last Friday. So these take place all the time, but sometimes it's like the sky is falling, and we hear that every day, and we get tired of putting a helmet on. I think a lot of us are going to be wearing helmets right now.
Clint, as we talk, you and I will be seeing for the first time, I'm told we have a new animation here that gives us a little idea as to what happened here. This is apparently the first attack. World Trade Center #1, that's the one on the left, is the first to be struck. In fact, well, and there it is. And then that was a little bit before 9 o'clock, and it was a short time later that the other one was struck, and ultimately both of them were brought down. And in both cases, there's 767s of planes that left Boston and were moved to Los Angeles. And here is that video that we have seen time and time again. Still very difficult to believe that someone could pull off such a horrible, horrible act. And in Lower Manhattan right now, the initial search has begun. Rescue workers getting toward ground zero, as it's being referred to try and find victims and perhaps those who may have survived this attack. I'm going to leave you now, but our continuing NBC News coverage of the attack on America resumes with Brian Williams in a moment. I'm Lester Holt. Thanks for being with us tonight. We invite you to keep it right here on NBC News for the very latest. Now, the congressional leadership earlier this evening.
That I love, stand beside her and guide her through the night with the light from above, from the mountains to the prairies to the ocean white with foam. God bless America, my home sweet home. God bless America, my home sweet home.
Today we've had a national tragedy.
I've never seen anything like it. It literally blew itself into World Trade Center.
Just a short time ago, saw the tail end of a large airliner plunge into the Pentagon.
I was in the building because I was driving a friend. So I was worried for her safety.
The World Trade Center is no more.
It is the worst attack on America in American history, and this is what the scene looks like live tonight from across the Hudson River. the smoke plume fading into the darkness of night in New York. The World Trade Center has been attacked and destroyed. The Pentagon has been attacked but still stands. And for a large portion of this day, the actual location of the President of the United States was not disclosed for security reasons. Here is what we know as we come on the air at 8 o'clock Eastern Time tonight. The President will speak in 1/2 hour, 8:30 p.m. The United States government is on its highest level of alert. That includes all armed forces around the globe. And while the death toll exactly is unknown at this hour and probably will be unknown for some days to come, the first early numbers are trickling in, like upwards of 200 New York City firefighters feared dead and 78 New York City police officers listed as missing. We will take an early look at the events of this day now. Here is NBC News correspondent David Bloom.
The first attack plane, a hijacked American Airlines flight out of Boston, slams into the North Tower of New York's World Trade Center at approximately 8:42 a.m. Eastern Time. The explosions and fireballs broadcast live by television helicopters, which then horrifically spot the second attack plane, a United Airlines flight hijacked from Boston, taking dead aim at the World Trade Center's South Tower. It's now approximately 9:03 a.m.
Where the hell can I meet you? I'm across the street from the Marriott, man. A second airplane, a 727, just rammed into the building.
Emergency officials estimate 20,000 or more people may have been inside the two 110-story buildings at the time of the attacks. Eyewitnesses report victims falling, and in some cases, jumping from the two buildings.
But there were people falling out of the sky.
At 9:29 a.m., President Bush in Florida addresses the nation for the first time.
Terrorism against our nation will not stand.
But in the nation's capital, just 11 minutes later, 9:40 a.m., a third hijacked plane, an American flight out of Washington Dulles, crashes into the Pentagon in a burst of flames, the plane's wreckage tearing a gaping hole into one side of the building. Federal buildings are evacuated, government leaders taken to secure hideouts. 9:59 a.m., the until now unthinkable, the South Tower of the World Trade Center collapses. An unknown number of people still trapped inside, including the rescuers, firefighters, and police who'd gone in trying to save lives. Then at 10 a.m., hundreds of miles away in western Pennsylvania, a fourth hijacked plane, a United flight out of Newark, crashes 80 miles southeast of Pittsburgh. 1/2 hour later, 10:28 a.m., the North Tower of the World Trade Center collapses. Rubble, debris spreading for blocks. In all, 266 people aboard 4 hijacked planes are killed. Untold others in Washington and New York missing and presumed dead. In New York, a defiant Mayor Rudolph Giuliani.
The city of New York in the United States of America is much stronger than any group of barbaric terrorists.
For the first time in U.S. history, the Federal Aviation Administration closes all domestic airports, shutting down all U.S. airspace until at least noon tomorrow. The U.S. military and American embassies worldwide placed on the highest alert. Navy aircraft carriers and destroyers deployed along the eastern seaboard. The president, now in Louisiana, speaks for a second time.
The resolve of our great nation is being tested. But make no mistake, we will show the world that we will pass this test.
The president is then taken to the secure Strategic Air Command in Nebraska, meets with his national security team via teleconference before boarding Air Force One to return to Washington. But in New York late this afternoon, a third damaged building, the 40-story World Trade Center number 7, also crashes to the ground. And emergency officials allow the first camera crew from NBC News inside the smoking hulks of the Twin Towers. Ground zero, cars overturned, steel torn apart, glass shards, small fires still burning. The very picture America most feared, the image terrorists most wanted.
And just tonight, long after the attack itself was over, the terrorist action seemed to continue with the collapse of a 40-story building in Lower Manhattan known as World Trade Number 7. NBC News correspondent Ashley Banfield witnessed the collapse while on the air with us. She has been on the scene in Lower Manhattan all day. Ashley, good evening to you.
Hi, Brian. Since we last spoke, I actually found out that since Tower 7 came down, the Marriott also came down just slightly west of it. So if Tower 7 were right behind me, the Marriott would have been just a wee bit over down the street towards the Hudson River. It also came down, but the fire official and police officials who told me that it had long since been evacuated and that there were no casualties. In fact, all of the evacuations of all of the World Trade Towers happened right after that first airplane slammed into the World Trade Tower that set off this whole thing at 8:45 Eastern this morning. I wanted to update you on some of the things that are going on behind me now. Certainly not as active as it has been all day, but there's still a lot of emergency vehicles coming in and out from different cities like we've been seeing. The response has been from all of the different counties, not only that, but other states as well, and different communities. And we've still seen a number of emergency vehicles going in and out. Look behind me, it's pitch black. There's a blackout now for about 30 blocks. I'd say 30 blocks north-south and about 4 blocks west and another